The Other Side of Ecstasy. Quote from the San Francisco Chronicle, January 2nd, 1987. Sporadic violence in several Bay Area communities blemished the promise of the new year yesterday as residents began 1987 by shooting, stabbing, and bombing one another. Dionysus lives in some strange places these days. He lives in the thrill we experience when we read about the latest terrorist bombing, the latest arson fire, the latest political assassination. As we sit calmly reading our morning newspaper, we hear a screech of brakes and a crash. Unbidden, we feel an enormous rush of energy. Cold chills go up and down our spine. We say, "How awful," and run outside to see the accident. This is poor quality Dionysus. This is what happens to a basic human drive that has not been lived out for nearly 4,000 years. When Lycurgus drove the armies of Dionysus from his country, he thought he'd gotten rid of the troublesome god for good. But Dionysus had merely gone into hiding deep beneath the sea, and when he re-emerged, it was with a violence terrifyingly powerful because it was the other side of another powerful quality, ecstasy. Like the unfortunate Lycurgus, we can refuse to recognize an archetype for as long as we wish, but, like Dionysus in hiding under the sea, it will not disappear. If we do not invest in it with our humanity, it will return to us in a dehumanized form, still charged with the same archetypal energy, but manifesting itself in a much more primitive way. In this chilling commentary, Jungian psychologist Marie-Louise von Franz explains how our refusal to honor an ethical, caring human drive can transform into something wild and destructive. What would it mean if an impulse appeared in a dream as a wolf or a tiger, or perhaps as a goat? Here, a psychological content has been wrongfully pushed into the body side and has been perverted so that it is no longer strictly human. It is a fact that if an impulse comes up and is not lived out, then it goes back down and tends to develop anti-human qualities. What should have been a human impulse becomes a tiger-like impulse. For instance, a man has a feeling impulse to say something positive to someone, and he blocks it off through inhibition. He might tend to dream that he has driven over a child with his car. He had a spontaneous feeling impulse on the level of his child, and his conscious purpose smashed it. The human is still there, but as a hurt child. Should he do that habitually for 5 years, he would no longer dream of a child who has been hurt, but a zoo full of raging wild animals in a cage. An impulse which is driven back, loads up with energy and becomes inhuman. You cannot kill a god, who is by definition immortal. Neither can you kill an archetype, for an archetype is a basic human drive. We carry the archetypes deep within us. They are integral parts of our human nature that must be lived out. When an archetype is not lived out with consciousness or dignity, as von Franz says, it loads up with energy and becomes inhuman. This happens not only on the level of the individual, but on the level of the collective unconscious, the psyche of a whole society. Carl Jung has said of this phenomenon, quote, "The gigantic catastrophes that threaten us are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological kind, but are psychic events. We are threatened in a fearful way by wars and revolutions that are nothing else than psychic epidemics. At any moment, a few million people may be seized by a madness, and then we have another world war or a devastating revolution. Instead of being exposed to a wild beasts, tumbling rocks, and inundating waters, man is exposed today to the elemental forces of his own psyche." End quote. This was brought home to me one day when a friend took me up to an air show. Thousands of people were in the crowd. I'd never been to such a thing before. My friend said, there's a tremendous amount of collective power in a group like this. They will demand blood, and they're strong enough to get it. At that very moment, a small plane crashed and burned right in front of us. I could feel the Dionysian energy galvanize the crowd, which was at once thrilled and horrified. It was a terrible form, but nonetheless the god was served. Looking for ecstasy in all the wrong places. Our society esteems thinking and doing, progress and success above all else. We go straight ahead, aiming for the top, looking out for number one in all our endeavors. If a given thing does not have a monetary value or show a concrete return, we will probably place it lower on the scale. We tend to like things we can control and dislike what we can't control or understand. These are the values of our patriarchal society. with his emphasis on power and acquisition, and it has won many fine prizes for us. With our love for discovery, facts, science, progress, and innovation, we would certainly not have all the medical advances that save lives or the machinery that makes our daily routine so much easier. All of this, however, has been won at the expense of less tangible qualities, feeling and intuition, caring and nurturing, empathy and receptivity, the Dionysian qualities. We tend to devalue them because they do not show us concrete rewards. Craving spiritual ecstasy, we mistakenly seek material fulfillment. We chase after a phantom, and when we catch it in the form of more money, more food, more sex, more drugs, more drinks, more oblivion, we find that we have been chasing ephemeral happiness when we should have invited in lasting joy. What do we do next? We can use all the intellectual power at our command to fill the void. We read books and take classes looking for the answer. But the answer can be found only in the sensuous world of Dionysus, and we have forgotten where that is. Dionysian malnutrition. We have chosen the quick fix over the spiritual nutrition of Dionysian energy, and we are starving because of it. I was vividly reminded of this by the following story. A British doctor ran across an interesting paradox. Indian Hindus in their usual diet don't get enough vitamin B12 to keep a rabbit alive, yet in general they do not suffer from B12 deficiency. How could this be? The doctor decided that neither his understanding of how much B12 the body needed was in error, or that the Hindu's diet included more B12 than the test indicated it did. So he went to India to study the problem more closely, and he found that the data were completely at odds. No, there was not enough vitamin B12 in the Hindu diet to keep a rabbit alive, yet the Hindus are doing well. Was it climate? Psychology? The doctor brought a Hindu man back to London with him so that he could perform more clinically precise tests in his own laboratory. He fed the Hindu exactly the same diet in England as the man had eaten in India, and quite soon the man came down with vitamin B12 deficiency. What had happened? It turned out that the English food was too clean. There were enough weevils in the flour and worms in the fruit of India to give the Hindus a bare minimum of B12 they needed to survive, but in the sanitized food of England there was not enough to meet the minimum daily requirements. This is exactly what we have done with Dionysus. We have cleansed him out of our consciousness, denied him on moral grounds, and we are worse for it. Like the weevils in the flour and the worms in the fruit, we get just enough poor quality Dionysus through auto accidents and screaming headlines, terrorism and street violence, drinking and drugs, to give us a little bit of ecstatic quality we need to keep alive. But, as with any addiction, we need more and more and more. Because of this, we're not getting the divine joy we actually need to satisfy us. We crave its opposite. Thus, robberies become muggings, muggings become beatings, beatings become shootings, shootings become bombings. And where will it end? This is the addictive behavior that plagues our society and touches every aspect of our lives. Sensation and materialism. When Western society chose to follow the erratic footsteps of the degraded Bacchus instead of the joyful dance of Dionysus, it began to confuse materialism with sensation. As a result, we citizens of the late 20th century can truly be said to have lost our senses, or at least to have lost contact with them. Even the clothes we wear tell us something is amiss. Both men and women today dress for success by wearing ties, in effect separating their heads, the thinking process, from the rest of their bodies, and thus symbolically cutting off sensation below their necks. When they take their ties off at the end of the day, they go wild, and all that bottled up sensation comes rushing out, looking for somewhere to go. At first glance, I suppose, our society looks terribly sensation-oriented. The flashing neon signs of Broadway, the almost naked bodies on billboards, our obsession with food and exercise. Originally, perhaps, we want these things for the pleasurable sensations they give us. But after a while, we develop a craving for sheer quantity and lose the sight of quality altogether. So it seems we are materially oriented, and that is a fine distinction to make. We want more things, more cars, more money, more clothes, more drugs, more fun. But we're frightened of touch, of making real contact with another person. We're more likely to take off all our clothes in front of a stranger than we are to let down our emotional defenses in front of someone we love. This unease with human contact is a reflection of the absence of good quality Dionysus, and it has been a great loss for our society. Never did I experience this loss more vividly than during a visit I made to Grace Episcopal Cathedral in San Francisco, soon after the custom of the passing of the peace had been instigated by the Episcopal Church. Robed and gloved, ushers came down from the altar and shook hands with a person at the beginning of the rows of the pews, and this peace was then handed from each person to person until the end of the row was reached. Well, the woman to my right was clearly horrified by this plan. She couldn't bear to touch a stranger. The Dionysian quality of being close was forbidden to her. She turned around to me with an anguished look on her face, proffered a glove hand, and stiffly put out her little finger. I took her little finger and shook it carefully with my thumb and forefinger. The pained embarrassment at not having to touch was vividly expressed between us. I don't get angry too often, but for some reason the anger just welled up in me over this. So I turned around to the man on my left, raised him up with a big bear hug, and sat him down again. The poor man was so embarrassed that when he sat staring me in front of him, the peace went no further. This is our general, official, and especially religious attitude towards sensation. Nice people don't do it. As for feelings, yes, you may have feelings, as long as they are very discreet and totally under control. I can't help contrasting this attitude with that of the Muslim world. There, if you're talking with a man and you stray further from 6 inches from his face while you are conversing, this is a public announcement of an insult. It means you don't like him. Of course, if you get within 6 inches of most Westerners, they become exceedingly uneasy and slowly begin to back up in an effort to increase the distance. Today, just as that woman, I can find no dignified way to exchange human touch. As a society, we have no respectful, dignified way to touch Dionysus. In the same way that my passing of the peace was transformed almost instantaneously into a passing of anger, our hunger for the sensuous Dionysian experience is transformed almost instantaneously into a search for sensuality. Thus, we cannot find the humanized archetype because we are looking in the wrong place and in the wrong way. Intimacy. We often bemoan the loss of intimacy in our society. We are quick to take a stranger to bed, but we are loath to be touched emotionally. When we lost the concept of touch as a way to contact God, we become ashamed of our natural urges and even guilty for our fantasies. Perhaps we most deeply fear the loss of ecstasy because implicit in it is a loss of control. Surrender, even to the divine, is something our culture does not encourage. Surrender to the divine means crossing over from our well-defined roles and worlds into the realm of the gods, where everything is possible and nothing is explained. We have no idea what to expect, and so we're afraid. As the poet T.S. Eliot said in Murder in the Cathedral, we fear the hand at the window, the fire in the thatch, less than we fear the love of God. Truly, to experience ecstasy, the love of God, would mean to invite profound change, and this we are unwilling to do. We run after sex, chasing the God again, but so often we get the dehumanized, poor-quality Dionysian experience. Poor-quality Dionysus, expressed sexually, is a terrible thing to behold. Instead of the love-making, we get rape, or sexual acts completely devoid of spirit. Just as we tried to cut off the heads from the rest of our bodies, we have tried to separate our sexuality from the rest of our lives. We have even given sex its own section of town. Here in the hours of darkness, what passes for sexual abandon in the 20th century flashes its lights and plays its music. Our metaphors for sex are filled with energy, but the energy does not strive upward. We say, get into it, get it off, do it to me. This low-grade ecstasy is enough to keep us going, but it does not lead us to transcendence. To drown our guilt and shut down the voices, we anesthetize ourselves with drugs and alcohol. Ironically, in other times and places, these substances were divine sacraments used to bring visions of God. With no sacred means of expression, we can express our need for Dionysus only symptomatically, through substance abuse, child molesting, and domestic violence, muggings, war, terrorism, madness. Intoxication. Dionysus is the god of wine and ecstasy, liberation and abandon. He is the perennial profusion of color and life and energy. When we touch Dionysus, we touch the irrational wisdom of the senses and experience joy. Because we have disallowed ourselves of this experience, however, we get a darker side of intoxication, a confusion of the senses that is far from spiritual. With the first sip of wine, we leave the everyday world and enter a new world, We are flushed with warmth and happiness, free to enjoy ourselves. We are still in control, but feel able to let go of our burdens. This is the point at which the followers of Dionysus stopped. In fact, some of them never drank wine at all. They needed to be conscious to experience divine ecstasy. You can't be joyous and dead drunk at the same time. Unfortunately, when we replaced Dionysus with a drunkard Bacchus, we forgot when to stop. Dionysus himself got drunk only once, and he didn't like it. To cure his wine-induced madness, he went for a visit to Zeus's shrine. One story has it that he bogged down in quicksand and was saved by a donkey, who took him, raving and drunk, but safe nonetheless, to Zeus. As recompense, Zeus gave the donkey human speech. The other story, which I like much better, is that Dionysus turned into a donkey and arrived at Zeus's shrine braying, which became human speech. So when we get drunk enough to get this jackass aspect going, we are no longer candidates for ecstasy. Our humanness is lost. Instead of taking the opportunity to transcend the material world, we keep drinking, or taking drugs, or trying to make money, or falling in love, to regain that first flush of happiness which we mistook for joy. Chase it as we might, however, happiness is by nature an ephemeral experience. As we drink, we become louder, looser, less in control of what we say and do. In trying to hold on to happiness, we slide headlong into despair. And if we continue to drink until we can drink no more, we are likely to become violent and ultimately unconscious. Ecstasy, a new stage. Why do we find this transcendent ecstasy such a difficult state to achieve? Perhaps because the concept is relatively new. The advent of Dionysus, the psychological archetype of ecstasy, represented a new stage in human development. The mighty Titans, the first gods of the earth, had never seen his like and tried to destroy him before he even got started. He was the last god to be added to the pantheon of Olympus, and the first to be torn down, which gives us an idea of how new an acquisition he is for the human race. Let me illustrate this fragility with a parallel from another realm. I am told that the color blue was the last to be added to our color sense, as it was the most often missing in colorblind people. The color blue is never mentioned in the Old Testament, and in all of ancient Greek writings, the color blue is never used. Even the Aegean, the most vividly blue of all the seas in the world, is described by Homer as the wine-dark sea. A faculty that is so new and so easily lost means that the human race is only just evolving that capacity into something like stability. It is the same with the Dionysian experience of spiritual ecstasy. It was the last faculty to be added to our repertoire and is the often most missing and least in our control. Some people burst spontaneously into a less violent, more genuinely ecstatic Dionysian quality. Such outbursts, however, are characteristically short-lived. Remember the hippie movement, which degenerated from the innocence of Woodstock to the violence of Altamont in the space of a year? We may envy people who quit their jobs, give away all their money, and try to commune with nature, but ultimately we will call them crazy and get on with our lives. It is not enough to throw the whole of society out over and over and go dance naked on the beach. Such experiments, however well-intentioned, are doomed to failure. We cannot simply move from the realm of rationality to the irrational realm of Dionysus and think that everything will be solved. This is either-or thinking. Jung has said that for us the choice is no longer either-or, but either and or. We must touch Dionysus, we must bring him back into our lives in a humanized form, or in denying him, we will destroy ourselves. This is the burden that is on us now, to keep the fine points of our patriarchal world in order, form, care, and structure, and bring the Dionysian back to enliven it without doing a flip-flop or going into pieces. Only in this way we can begin to move towards wholeness and joy.